Forget everything you thought you knew from the silver screen depiction of West Side Story. Wipe the romanticized images of knife-wielding Puerto Ricans serenading each other in New York alleyways from your mind. Hollywood sold you a beautiful fabrication, all wrapped up in Bernstein's stunning music. The actual narrative of the Latin Kings did not begin with choreography or even with narcotics. It was forged in the sickening sound of bones cracking on Chicago's frozen asphalt, mingled with the stench of cheap whiskey and fresh blood. To comprehend how a collection of terrified adolescents ballooned into an international terror syndicate, one that dictates life and death from Illinois prisons to the thoroughfares of Madrid, you must look not at their shining gold crowns, but at the bruises that marked their faces back in the middle of the 1950s. Picture Chicago in the year 1954. The neighborhood was Humboldt Park. Today, real estate agents might label this area up and coming, but back then, it was a war zone, a grimy ghetto where immigrants from Puerto Rico were jammed together like livestock. They arrived chasing the American dream, only to encounter the icy reality of segregation. To the white establishment, they were mere low-wage labor, third-class citizens, filth. But the real menace wasn't emanating from the politicians, it festered in the streets. These blocks were dominated by established white youth gangs, the so-called greasers, gaylords, and C-notes. These were no noble knights. They were predatory packs organizing genuine safaris against anyone whose skin was even slightly darker than their own. If you were Latino and accidentally stepped over the invisible boundary of Lincoln Park, you didn't just get mugged, you were beaten senseless with baseball bats, chains, and lengths of iron rebar. The Chicago police force of that era operated on a straightforward principle. If the victim couldn't speak English without an accent, the crime simply didn't register. And here, we confront an uncomfortable truth that sociologists and prosecutors often try to silence. The Latin Kings didn't become criminals and murderers because they were born with some inherent gene for violence or a thirst for easy money. They transformed into a gang because white Chicago society actively sought to physically crush them. Racism was the progenitor of this monster, and state indifference was its mother. This wasn't about avarice. It was pure, unadulterated Darwinism, organize or perish. In this tempest of brutality, where an unattached individual was destined for either the emergency room or the morgue, a figure who would become legendary emerged, Ramon Santos, known to history as King Papo. Alongside Eddie the Tigre and a handful of other desperate youths, they grasped the simple street arithmetic. 10 weak men can overcome one strong one. In 1954, they established what was never intended to be a criminal syndicate. It was a shield, not a sword. They branded themselves a social club, and their primary task wasn't heroin trafficking, but the mundane act of walking children to school safely so their heads wouldn't be smashed by stones thrown by white adolescents. However, the evolution of violence is relentless. One cannot remain purely defensive forever when continuously under attack. By the early 1960s, the survival philosophy began its inevitable shift. The shield morphed into a fist. The group started absorbing smaller outfits, such as the Imperial Gangsters, thus bulking up their strength. It was then that the rough outlines of their ideology began to coalesce, a potent brew of Catholicism, tribal loyalty, and a street code of honor. Also around the start of the 1960s, their defining visual signature appeared, the colors black and gold. This was no mere fashion statement. Black symbolized the death that shadowed them daily, a mourning for fallen brothers. Gold represented the hope for a vibrant life, a bright future they lacked and decided to seize by force. Wearing these colors in Chicago in 1960 was tantamount to painting a target on your back. Yet for gang members, it became a sacred uniform. Later, the very loss of these colors, for instance, if enemies ripped off their beads, would cause them to execute their own members. The metamorphosis from neighborhood defenders to predators was driven by starkly economic necessity. War is expensive. Defending territory requires weapons. Springing brothers from police precincts demands legal counsel. Burying those lost in street battles, which was the most frequent line item, requires capital. The contributions from dishwashers and porters proved insufficient. The club faced a moral crossroad that would dictate its trajectory for the next half-century: remain impoverished victims or become criminals and survive. They chose the latter path. Initial robberies commenced, then the racket against small shopkeepers, followed by early forays into drug distribution. By 1964, the idealistic veneer of defenders of the oppressed was crumbling, revealing the rapacious sneer of organized crime. The streets of Humboldt Park were no longer just where they lived. They had become their proprietary territory. They were prepared to spill others' blood for every single inch of it. What began as self-defense devolved into aggressive expansion, and soon, this localized inferno would spread to where true demons are bred, the state penitentiaries. If the streets of Humboldt Park served as the nursery for the nascent monster, the correctional facilities of the state of Illinois became its Harvard. Towards the mid-1960s, the Chicago police, confident in the efficacy of brute force, began mass incarcerating the group's leadership, naively believing that prison walls would decapitate the movement. This proved to be a fatal strategic miscalculation that would cost thousands of lives in the ensuing decades. Instead of dissolving, the scattered street cliques found themselves confined in a closed arena, where, under the intense pressure of a hostile environment, predominantly African-American gangs, they underwent a process of crystallization, solidifying into a monolithic structure. It is at this juncture that a figure enters whose name in the king hierarchy is pronounced with religious dread: Gustavo Colon, otherwise known as Lord Gino. It was Colon who grasped that surviving in the concrete meat grinder of Stateville Prison demanded not just aggression, but near military discipline and an unyielding ideology. By the late 1960s, the transformation of street thugs into the ALKQN, the almighty Latin King and Queen Nation, was underway. This was no longer a rabble of hooligans. It was a corporation boasting a power structure that the top brass at General Motors would have envied. A system of ranks was implemented: Inca, supreme leader; cacique, second only to God; enforcers, treasurers. Yet, Lord Gino's most potent weapon was not a sharpened length of rebar, but paper. In the damp cells of Stateville, the King Manifesto was penned, a document that became the sacred text for tens of thousands of outlaws. It was a hellish amalgamation of Puerto Rican nationalism, twisted Catholicism, and the street code of honor. The manifesto dictated everything, from how one was to pray — yes, they developed their own prayers — to the proper protocol for executing a nation's enemy. The visual embodiment of this emergent religion became the collares, the black and gold beads. Here lies a crucial detail often missed by purely theoretical criminologists. For a gang member, these beads are neither costume jewelry nor mere ornamentation. They function as both a military identification card and a death warrant, packaged together. The strict pattern of the beads, 5 black, 5 gold, symbolized the 5-pointed crown. In the 1970s, wearing these beads inside Illinois prisons was an act of suicidal courage. If an enemy faction snatched the beads from a king's neck, he was compelled to cleanse the dishonor with blood, either his own or the enemy's. The loss of the collars was subsequently punished internally by brutal beatings and, at times, execution. It was a mechanism of control that bound the individual to the organization more tightly than any physical chain. The prison wing economy during this period began generating revenue comparable to that of small factories. Imagine a closed ecosystem where a pack of cigarettes commanded a price equivalent to a gold ingot on the outside. The kings rapidly monopolized internal trade, drugs, liquor, and protection for vulnerable inmates. All profits were subjected to taxation, flowing upward to the crown. But their most vital resource was people. By 1978, the demographics within Illinois prisons had shifted drastically, and the tension between Latinos and African-American gangs reached a critical flashpoint. Larry Hoover, leader of the Gangster Disciples, was busy constructing his folk nation empire, uniting black gangs under the symbol of the six-pointed star. Gustavo Colon countered with a stroke of brilliant diplomacy, forging the People Nation Alliance. It was a watershed moment. Sworn enemies on the outside, the Latin Kings, the Vice Lords, a black gang, and the Islamic radicals known as ALKQN, united under the symbol of the five-pointed star. The number 5 became sacred to the kings. The prisons fractured into two hostile camps, the people and the folk. This division spilled beyond the bars, flooding the streets of Chicago with bloodshed. War was waged for every square foot of the prison yard. Murders in the showers, stabbings in the mess halls, boiling water laced with sugar, a horrific concoction that clings to the skin like napalm, thrown in a rival's face. These became the grim routines of institutionalization. By 1980, Gustavo Colon, despite being incarcerated with a life sentence for a contract killing, wielded more authority than the prison warden. He determined who lived and who died simply by transmitting notes, or kites, through compromised correctional officers. The structure was perfectly lubricated. The Inca's order descended the chain of command and was executed without question. If the Crown ordered the termination of a renegade, they would find him even in solitary confinement. It was during this time that the foundation was laid for the TOS system, terminate on sight, which effectively rendered any expelled member a walking corpse. By the dawn of the new decade, the Latin Kings had definitively evolved from street gang to paramilitary cult, exhibiting fanatical devotion to their leader and preparing to export their bloody ideology beyond the Midwest, where their methods would seem child's play compared to what they were about to unleash in New York. While Chicago learned to function under the dictates of Lord Geno's Manifesto, building a sophisticated corporate framework on the East Coast, something more than an ideology was migrating. It was a virus that mutated into something utterly monstrous within the fetid environment of New York. The carrier of this infection was a man whose name would soon make even the most seasoned Bronx detectives flinch: Luis Felipe, a Cuban immigrant better known as King Blood. If Gustavo Colon was the chief executive officer of the gang, Felipe became its high priest and executioner. His journey to New York was not a calculated expansion. It was the escape of a rat from a sinking ship. In Chicago, he was a nobody, a minor criminal running from justice and debt, but in the chaos of mid-'80s New York, he perceived the perfect fertile ground for his ambitions. The history of the bloodline did not commence with grand confrontations, but with a sordid, mundane murder, devoid of any gangster glamour. Felipe, an alcoholic and a sadist, beat his live-in partner Tanya to death in a drunken haze. This single crime, for which he received a sentence at the Collins Correctional Facility, should have been the terminal point of his insignificant life. But the New York State prison system, overcrowded and collapsing under the heroin epidemic, made the fatal error of underestimating that small man with the wild stare. In 1986, while pacing the yard at Collins Prison, Felipe realized the local Latinos were a scattered flock desperately in need of a shepherd. He lacked official sanction from the Chicago Mother Lodge, but he possessed the charisma of a psychopath and an intimate knowledge of the king structure. It is here, in the shadow of the guard towers, that the narrative usually omitted from official reports unfolded, yet it explains why this abscess wasn't lanced immediately. Picture a correctional officer, let's call him Miller, on duty in the Block B cafeteria in that same year, 1986. He was an average employee, a father of 3, just aiming for retirement. Miller watched the inmates begin to cluster around Felipe. He saw strange gestures, fingers intertwined to form a crown shape, hands pressed over chests as pledges of loyalty. He heard snatches of talk about the Almighty Father and watched inmates discreetly passing around handwritten copies of a new constitution. Regulations mandated reporting the formation of a new security threat group, STG. But Miller stayed silent. Why? Because in a prison where there are 100 cutthroats for every one guard, snitching means risking not making it to the parking lot. It's better they pray to their king and keep discipline than slit each other's throats over a shank. he rationalized to himself and dozens of his colleagues. Uti. This silence of the everyman became the bedrock upon which King Blood constructed his domain. Unlike the Chicago model, which at that time sought political traction and legalization, the New York faction, termed the Bloodline, was built upon the bedrock of pure distilled violence. Felipe, proclaiming himself Inca of the First Crown, distilled the philosophy down to a primal death cult, where, in Chicago, a transgression might be absolved with a fine or a beating. In New York, the slightest disobedience triggered a TOS order, terminate on sight. This was not merely a threat, it was a bureaucratic procedure. The offender's name was entered onto a list distributed to every prison in the state. From that moment on, any gang member encountering the renegade was obligated to attempt his killing, or he himself would land on that same list. By 1989, the bloodline structure had expanded like a malignant tumor. Felipe instituted a rigid hierarchy: First Crown, himself; Second Crown, President; Third Crown, Minister of Defense. Every position was doubled so that if a leader was transferred to another facility, the structure would not collapse. Recruitment was aggressive. New arrivals, often frightened teenagers locked up for stealing a car radio, were presented with a simple bargain: become a king and gain protection, or remain a nobody and become a victim. The economy of this system was fueled by fear. Felipe did not pay his soldiers, they paid him. Contributions, or quotas, were collected even from those who could barely afford toothpaste. Those unable to pay settled their debts in blood by completing missions to eliminate rivals. Particular attention must be paid to King Blood's methods of execution. These were not quick jabs to the liver. They were ritualistic murders designed to instill sheer terror. One of the most heinous examples from that era was the punishment meted out to a member suspected of stealing from his comrades. He wasn't merely killed, he was strangled in the showers by multiple individuals, as others loudly recited the King's Prayer, drowning out the dying man's gasps. They attempted to dismember the body and dispose of the pieces down the sewage lines. Cruelty became a trademark. By 1990, when Felipe was relocated to a different facility, he left behind a perfectly oiled killing machine that could no longer be contained within the confines of the state correctional system. The Latin kings were primed to spill out onto the streets of New York, and their next target would not just be control of the prison yard, but the conquest of America's most infamous and terrifying isolation block, Rikers Island, which they intended to transform into their personal torture dungeon. If the New York State correctional facilities served as the Latin Kings universities, the Rikers Island prison complex in the early 1990s morphed into their personal testing ground for weapons of mass destruction, where human life was valued less than a pack of Newport cigarettes. Between 1991 and 1994, this sliver of land in the East River Strait ceased being a place of incarceration and morphed into a sovereign state of terror, where the administration controlled only the perimeter, while inside, laws written in an isolation cell by a madman reigned supreme. Luis Felipe, King Blood, had by then attained especially dangerous status and was separated from the general inmate population. But this very isolation played a cruel trick on the judicial system. Deprived of physical contact with his flock, Felipe transformed correspondence into an instrument of absolute power, sending hundreds of coded letters that, on the outside, became sacred scripture for thousands of adolescents. In those years, the King's structure on Rikers Island achieved a terrifying efficiency. It was not merely a gang, it was an army complete with intelligence, counterintelligence, and most chillingly, a Department of Internal Affairs that punished the slightest deviation from the code. Every morning, in the yards of the 10 housing blocks, what was known as the Universal Meeting took place. Hundreds of inmates stood in precise formations, simultaneously pounding their fists on their chests and reciting prayers to their king who remained in isolation. The guards, outnumbered by the gang members by a ratio of 1 to 50, preferred to look the other way so long as their shift ended without casualties. Yet, casualties appeared with methodical regularity, and methods of punishment grew increasingly sophisticated, turning violence into grotesque ritual. It was precisely during this time, in 1993, that a term chilling the blood of even the most seasoned pathologists entered the New York criminal lexicon: the champagne bath. The name, sounding like an element of luxurious living, was, in reality, a euphemism for one of the most agonizing executions in American prison history. The recipe for this cocktail was simple and monstrous: a bucket of boiling water into which several pounds of sugar or baby oil had been dissolved. The resulting syrupy substance, when thrown into the victim's face, acted like napalm. It didn't just burn, it adhered to the skin, continuing the thermal effect until the flesh separated from the bone. This execution was not reserved for enemies of other gangs, but for their own members, for theft from the common fund, for cowardice, or for casting a wrong look at the section leader. The victim would be shoved into the showers, and while one brother poured the infernal mixture, the others formed a circle, blocking the view of surveillance cameras and guards. The zenith of the madness arrived in 1994, when King Blood's disciplinary measures exceeded the limits of physical comprehension of cruelty. An emblematic case, one that made its way into criminology manuals, was the murder of William Cartagena. His crime was criticizing Felipe's methods. The sentence was passed in absentia via a note sent from isolation. Cartagena was not merely killed, he was strangled and then dismembered right inside his cell. His head and arms were severed to complicate identification, and they attempted to dispose of the remains down the toilet, one piece at a time. When the plumbing backed up and red water began flowing down the corridor, the extent of the Latin King's control became starkly apparent. They felt so emboldened as to orchestrate a slaughter in a building teeming with guards and spend hours concealing evidence, completely unafraid of sudden inspections. The paradox of the situation was that the system itself had birthed this monster. A NYPD detective working in the gang intelligence unit during those years, in a private conversation many years later, admitted the total defeat of law enforcement at that time. "We thought we had caged the beast by isolating Felipe. We were naive. In reality, we gave him a fortress. We provided him security, food, and a postal service, allowing him to command an army of murderers without ever leaving his bunk. Rikers became his headquarters, and we were his doormen." This expert assessment accurately captures the atmosphere of despair. The prison was not rehabilitating, it was radicalizing. Those who ended up on Rikers for petty theft emerged a year later as soldiers of the almighty nation, having received baptism by fire and boiling sugar. By the end of 1994, the situation had become critical. Felipe's letters, intercepted by censorship, but often allowed through due to a lack of translators who understood the slang, contained direct orders for the elimination of entire families of rivals on the outside. The Latin Kings became the dominant force not only in prisons, but began expanding into the streets of the Bronx and Brooklyn, where they were welcomed as heroes returned from war. King Blood's power seemed boundless, and his cruelty absolute. But deep within the organization, weary of paranoid terror and endless purges, a demand for change was already brewing. Empires built solely on fear can last a long time, but they are fragile internally. On the horizon, a new figure was emerging, a man who would attempt to place a mask of respectability onto this bloodthirsty monster and lead the Kings down a path that would prove even more dangerous than open warfare. By 1995, the federal justice machine finally grasped that fighting the Latin Kings with conventional solitary confinement methods was like trying to extinguish a fire with gasoline. Luis Felipe, despite being in solitary confinement, managed thousands of soldiers more effectively than many Pentagon generals. The system's response was brutal and definitive. King Blood was sentenced to 250 years in confinement and transferred to ADX Florence in the state of Colorado, a supermax facility that inmates themselves call the clean version of hell. A concrete coffin, 23 hours a day in his cell, total isolation from the outside world, and a ban on correspondence with his brothers. The head of the serpent had been severed and entombed among the rocks of the Rocky Mountains, but the body, left on the streets of New York, did not die. It mutated, growing a new head, one far more cunning, media-savvy, and dangerous due to its deceptive civility. Antonio Fernandez, known throughout the criminal underworld as King Tone, ascended the throne. The change of command in 1996 marked the beginning of the most surreal period in the gang's history. If Felipe was a butcher, Fernandez became a marketing guru and a politician. He understood that open warfare against the New York police of the Giuliani era was a path to suicide. The Kings needed a complete rebranding. Fernandez launched a massive campaign for the group's legalization, striving to convince society that the ALKQN was not a gang of murderers, but a social organization dedicated to defending the rights of Latinos, education, and fighting poverty. It was a brilliant and cynical disguise. Thugs who only yesterday were dissolving people in acid and shooting rivals in the Bronx suddenly donned clean shirts and took to the streets outside the United Nations headquarters, demanding social justice. The media sphere exploded. Fernandez gave interviews, starred in documentaries such as the sensational HBO feature Black and Gold, where he eloquently discussed brotherhood and spiritual growth. He banned his soldiers from participating in petty street robberies, drive-bys, declaring such acts unworthy of a king. In place of shivs, the hands of gang members began holding flyers inviting people to register to vote. But beneath this glossy facade of street activism lurked the same machine for converting drugs into cash, only now it operated under the cloak of ideology. While King Tone spoke from podiums, his lieutenants continued to control the drug trade in Spanish Harlem and Brooklyn, using their newfound reputation as a shield against police raids. The logic was simple. Arresting a thug is easy, but arresting a social activist invites scandal and accusations of racism. Here we arrive at the most complex moral dilemma necessary to perceive in order to comprehend this structure's survival. Imagine being a 16-year-old Puerto Rican in the South Bronx in 1997. The school system has discarded you, there is destitution at home, and the police view you as a criminal simply because of the circumstances of your birth. Then, Antonio Fernandez appears. He doesn't offer you a dose of narcotics. He offers you pride. He tells you that you are the descendant of great kings, not street filth. He gives you a family, protection, and a purpose. Would you have enlisted in this army knowing the price for this love was the readiness to kill upon command? Thousands of adolescents answered yes without hesitation. Fernandez masterfully manipulated the emotions of the marginalized, converting their pain into a resource for his enterprise. This was not simple gang recruitment, it was conscription into a cult where social justice was the bait and the hook was lifelong criminal enslavement. However, Fernandez's double game generated monstrous internal tension within the organization. The old guard, hardened in the bloodbaths of Rikers Island, viewed these democracy games with contempt. To them, King Tone was soft, a traitor to the tenets of the bloodline. They saw strategy, not weakness, in rallies and interviews. Simultaneously, brutal warfare continued on the streets for territory. Under the guise of peace slogans, the Latin kings pursued aggressive expansion, displacing Dominican and African American crews from the most lucrative crack and heroin sales territories. The peaceful activists transformed into ruthless liquidators by night. Murders did not cease, but they became quieter. Bodies were no longer discovered in central squares, but in the basements of abandoned buildings, so as not to tarnish the image of a social organization. The gang's economy reached its peak during these years. Quotas were collected with the terrifying efficiency of a tax office. Every spot, drug location, paid a tariff to the kingdom's coffers. The money was needed not only for lawyers and corruption, but also to maintain the leader's public image. Fernandez lived the life of a crime rock star, navigating between meetings with human rights advocates and powwows with drug kingpins. But this construction, founded on falsehood, was destined to collapse. The New York police and the FBI were not fooled by the pretty picture. To them, Fernandez was no Martin Luther King. He was an Al Capone who had merely swapped a Tommy gun for a microphone. By 1998, while Antonio Fernandez basked in his media notoriety, the net was tightening around him. Federal agents understood. To destroy the Hydra, they had to strike not the tails, but the very heart. They initiated an operation unmatched in scope of infiltration and technological resources. Agents knew that behind the scenes of political meetings, cocaine deals and orders for eliminating dissidents were being discussed. The era of activism was merely a colorful screen-hiding preparations for the most spectacular collapse in the gang's history. The Latin kings believed they had beaten the system by going legitimate, but in reality, they had only become a more visible target. The Operation Crown, designed to demolish this paper empire, was mere months away, and the countdown had already begun in the offices of the federal building in Manhattan. As Antonio Fernandez preached cultural rebirth and the fight against police brutality from stages in the basements of Spanish Harlem and the Bronx, an accounting system was ceaselessly at work whose efficiency could have inspired envy in Wall Street auditors. The structure of the Latin Kings by the late 1990s was not a chaotic gang, but a rigidly regulated financial pyramid where cash flows were controlled with a meticulousness bordering on obsession. The foundation of this submerged economy lay in the principle of cuotas, mandatory membership fees that had transformed the gang into a multi-million-dollar corporation parasitic upon the misery of its own soldiers. It was the first street franchise in history. You obtained the brand, the cover, and the right to wear the colors, and in return, you ceded a percentage of every dollar earned, whether from dealing narcotics or stealing a car radio. Let us examine the economics of this kingdom in stark, dry figures to see the chasm between a common foot soldier and the elite. The average weekly fee for a regular member, soldier, in New York ranged from $15 to $25. Does that sound trivial? Multiply that by 4,000 active members in one city alone. That translates to $60,000 to $100,000 of clean cash per week, or up to $5 million annually, collected merely for breathing the air. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. The primary income stemmed from the land tax. If you controlled a drug spot in King territory, you were obligated to pay rent. The takings from an average crack or heroin sales point in the South Bronx were approximately $10,000 to $15,000 daily. From this sum, the Crown extracted 10 to 20%. The section leader, or Inca, kept a portion, and the remainder was delivered to the regional treasurer, with the suitcases of cash eventually ascending to the apex of the pyramid. A bureaucracy worthy of a state institution reigned in this system. Every section, tribe/chapter, had its own treasurer who maintained the book, a literal ledger where names, dates, and sums were meticulously recorded. It was these very books which the gangsters foolishly guarded like relics that later became the primary evidence for the prosecution. Everything was logged therein. Expenditures for weapons procurement, the black market for Glocks and Tech-9s flourished, a standard piece costing $300 to $500. Payment for lawyers for arrested brothers. A good defense attorney in New York cost $20,000 or more per case, and most cynically, funeral expenses. The death fund was a mandatory expense category. When another teenager was felled in the war for a street corner, the gang paid for the casket and the black and gold wreaths, essentially purchasing the loyalty of the deceased's family. However, the distribution of wealth was grotesquely unjust. The common king, who risked their lives on street corners, earned mere scraps. Their real income rarely exceeded $300 or $400 a week, less than a McDonald's employee once fees, fines, and personal drug consumption were deducted. Meanwhile, the organization's apex, the so-called Supreme Crown, wallowed in luxury. Antonio Fernandez and his inner circle drove luxury SUVs, wore designer clothing, and resided in penthouses purchased through shell corporations. The income disparity was colossal. The annual earnings of a high-ranking Inca could reach $200,000 to $300,000 tax-free dollars, while the infantry died for the privilege of wearing cheap plastic beads. It was classic exploitation. Leaders peddled the illusion of brotherhood, converting adolescent blood into real estate and gold chains. The debt collection system was merciless and functioned better than any collection agency. If a member missed the weekly universal meeting or failed to remit his quota, a late fee was immediately assessed. Fines were levied for everything: tardiness, unkempt appearance, loss of symbology. If cash was unavailable, the debt was collected physically. A clear penalty schedule existed. For a minor infraction or debt, the 360 degrees, where the guilty party was encircled by 3 or 4 brothers and beaten for a set duration, usually 30 or 60 seconds. For serious financial misconduct, fractures of limbs. For theft from the kaja, the safe, death. The logic was simple. You can fool the police, you can fool your mother, but you cannot fool the nation. The fear of their own internal accounting was greater than the fear of prison. The legalization of drug proceeds was managed through rudimentary yet effective schemes. The Latin kings opened small businesses en masse: barbershops, corner stores, bodegas, and cheap clothing outlets. These locations served a dual purpose. They laundered cash and acted as meeting hubs. In the back rooms of the barbershops, while clients were getting haircuts in the front, leaders counted mountains of crumpled bills smelling of marijuana and sweat. Fernandez attempted to elevate these flows to a new level, planning investments in legitimate real estate and even the music industry, rap labels. But the criminal inertia was too powerful. Money earned through blood demanded protection, and protection required weapons and new soldiers, thus closing the vicious circle of expenditures. The financial model of the Latin kings during this period clearly exposed the lie of their ideology. They presented themselves as an anti-capitalist force, fighting the system, yet they had effectively constructed the most rigid and predatory form of capitalism. They created no product. They taxed vice and fear. The dealer paid for the right to stand on the corner, the prostitute paid for security, the schoolchild paid to avoid being beaten on the way home. It was parasitism elevated to the nth degree. But it was precisely this paper trail, this obsession with lists and reports used to control millions of dollars, that became their Achilles heel. The feds, upon launching their hunt, understood. To convict a king, you don't need to catch him holding a gun. You just need to find his black ledger. The operation to dismantle the empire shifted from street surveillance to financial auditing, and the results of this investigation promised to be a conviction for the entire leadership. By the close of 1997, the federal building on St. Andrews Plaza in Lower Manhattan had become the nerve center of an operation unparalleled in scope in the history of fighting New York street gangs. While Antonio Fernandez delivered speeches on social justice and his treasurers meticulously logged the profits from heroin sales in their notebooks, agents from the FBI, NYPD detectives, and the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, joined forces within the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Their objective was not merely to arrest a few corner dealers. Their goal was the complete decapitation of the organization utilizing the American justice system's nuclear weapon, the RICO Act, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The irony was that the Latin kings' own bureaucratic obsession, their desire to document every move and every dollar, became the very map the feds used to reach their target. Those famous books and membership lists, which were supposed to guarantee order in the nation, turned into ready-made indictments. The investigation, codenamed Operation Crown, was conducted under a news blackout. Agents employed the classic tactic of infiltration, but at a new level. They didn't just insert their own men, they recruited disillusioned insiders. Dissatisfaction was growing within the organization. Old soldiers who had risked their lives watched the leadership squandering communal funds on personal comfort, and this resentment became fertile ground for betrayal. Key informants, whose names were sealed under aliases like Source A and Source B, carried recording devices directly into the weekly universal meetings. Every word from King Tone, every order to beat a debtor, every discussion about bulk cocaine purchases, all of it was captured on tape and appended to the case file. Fernandez thought he was playing chess with public opinion, but in reality, he was already under the crosshairs of a precision scope. Tension peaked in the spring of 1998. The empire's fall was hours away, and this moment demands a detailed reconstruction to grasp the electricity of that night. Imagine the night before the raid. The clock strikes 2 in the morning. In the FBI and NYPD command centers, the lights are blazing. Hundreds of agents in vests emblazoned with "Federal Agent" check weapons, battering rams, and address lists. 3:30 in the morning. Assault teams move into position, locking down entire blocks in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens. This was not a targeted operation. It was a military campaign. 4:45 in the morning, radio communications explode with the command, "Go!" Simultaneously, dozens of doors are breached. Sleeping kings are dragged from their beds. Sacred beads, weapons, and stacks of cash tumble to the floor. The gang's alarm system, which they had been so proud of, failed. The strike was too massive and perfectly synchronized. The arrest of Antonio Fernandez himself became the climax of this spectacle and the definitive destruction of the peaceful activist myth. When the feds stormed his residence, they did not find civil rights literature, but evidence that could not be explained away by political struggle. Despite all efforts to cultivate an image of a legitimate leader, Fernandez was apprehended as part of a case that included conspiracy charges for drug distribution and organizing murders. Along with him, over 100 key figures were handcuffed: regional generals, treasurers, security coordinators. Police vans, packed with the elite of the Latin kings, lined up outside the federal courthouse. The entire vertical power structure, built over years, collapsed in one morning. What Felipe had built over a decade, Fernandez lost in one night, having believed in his own invincibility. The searches yielded a haul that shocked even the most cynical prosecutors. Seized were not only pounds of cocaine and arsenals of unregistered weapons, including automatic rifles and submachine guns, but also that infamous black accounting. Lists containing the names, addresses, ranks, and contribution amounts of thousands of gang members fell into FBI hands. Anonymity was over. Now the feds knew the face of every soldier. The myth that the crown would protect them crumbled to dust. The final drama of that era played out in courtrooms. Leaders who had sworn eternal fealty to the almighty nation began mass mutiny, betraying each other for plea bargains. The RICO statute carried potential life sentences, and faced with the real prospect of 20 or 30 years in prison, the code of honor proved to be an empty phrase. King Tone himself, confronted with a choice, become a martyr and face life imprisonment or accept a plea deal, chose pragmatism. He pleaded guilty in exchange for a 12-year sentence instead of the life term he faced, effectively admitting that his entire legalization effort had been a front for drug trafficking. This confession became a moral failure for the organization. Thousands of young followers who had believed in his revolutionary rhetoric felt betrayed. The empire lost not only its leader, but also its ideological axis. Operation Crown did not physically destroy the gang. The street infantry remained free, but it shattered centralized power. The Latin kings ceased to be a unified army, devolving into fragmented tribes tearing at each other for the remnants of influence. It was the end of the age of great kings and the beginning of the age of chaos, where discipline was replaced by anarchy and ideology by pure, unadulterated criminal business, which would soon seek new outlets far beyond the borders of the United States, exporting violence across the ocean as if it were a fast food franchise. Following the collapse of the centralized power structure in New York due to Operation Crown, the organization didn't vanish. It entered a state that oncologists term metastasis. The early 2000s were marked by the disintegration of the unified army into hundreds of autonomous tribes, each establishing its own set of rules for the assigned streets. The power vacuum in the Bronx and Queens was instantly filled by a new, even more savage form of violence. If in the 90s, war was fought for ideology and millions, in the 2000s it devolved into a primitive slaughter over street corners. New players entered the scene, driving out the weakened kings, the Dominican gang Trinitarios, with their signature machetes, and the Salvadoran MS-13. The East Coast streets turned into a patchwork quilt stitched with barbed wire, where alliances shifted weekly and the level of cruelty was determined not by strategy, but by the availability of bladed weapons. It was precisely in this period of chaos and fragmentation that the Latin kings executed their most unexpected and strategically vital maneuver, transatlantic expansion. The virus born in Chicago crossed the ocean. Picture a world map. A red line shoots out from New York and Chicago, crosses through Ecuador and the Dominican Republic, and then, like a conquistador's arrow fired in reverse, pierces the heart of old Europe, Spain. In February of 2000, in Madrid, the city of museums and royal palaces, Eric Javier Velástegui, known as King Wolverine, founded the sacred tribe of Spanish America, Sagrada Tribu America, Spain. This was not a spontaneous gathering of youths. It was the exportation of a terror franchise, maintaining all the regalia, liturgy, and hierarchy, but adapted to the realities of European immigration policies. Spain in the early 2000s became the perfect incubator. Thousands of young migrants from Ecuador, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic, feeling like outsiders in conservative Spanish society, were searching for an identity. Velástegui provided it. He created a state within a state right in the plazas of Madrid, such as Puerta del Sol and Príncipe Pío. The structure was copied directly from the New York model: Inca, cacique, weekly fees, and physical punishments. But while in the United States the police already knew who they were dealing with, the Guardia Civil in Spain initially saw them as merely noisy teenagers in baggy pants. This was a fatal blindness. By 2005, the number of Latin kings in Madrid, Barcelona, and Valencia was counted in the thousands. They carved up the subway system into zones of influence, and woe betide anyone who entered a rival station wearing the wrong colors. The war that erupted in the streets of Spanish cities was no less brutal than those in American ghettos. The primary antagonist for the kings became the Puerto Rican gang, Ñetas. Madrid's parks became arenas for gladiatorial combat, where firearms were less common. Obtaining guns in Europe is more difficult. But ham knives, screwdrivers, and machetes were readily available. One of the most resonant crimes that brought the abscess to public light was an attack in a subway station in 2003, where a group of kings in broad daylight assaulted a rival, inflicting dozens of stab wounds before the eyes of stunned tourists. Old Europe realized with horror that gangster culture was not a cinematic myth, but a reality that had arrived via the metro. Parallel to the Spanish outpost, the metastases reached Italy. In Milan and Genoa, where large communities of Latin Americans had formed, their own tribes sprang up. The Italian police, accustomed to battling organized mafia, were confronted by the phenomenon of street gangs whose objective was not to rake in billions, but who were ready to kill over a sideways glance. In the years from 2006 to 2008, Milanese crime reports were filled with accounts of knife fights between the Latin kings and MS-13, turning Italy's industrial capital into the battleground for two American franchises. This was globalization in its ugliest manifestation. Gangs born in Illinois and Los Angeles were slitting each other's throats in Lombardy to the beat of aggressive reggaeton. But behind the street violence, there was also an economic motivation. The globalization of the network allowed for the establishment of new narcotics transit routes. The Dominican Republic became a transshipment point, and Madrid's Barajas airport became the primary gateway for cocaine into Europe. The Latin kings, having their own soldiers on both sides of the Atlantic, began providing logistical services to Mexican and Colombian cartels. The scheme was simple and effective. A brother in Quito or Santo Domingo prepares the shipment, and a brother in Madrid receives it and guarantees security. The volumes were not those of Escobar, but it was a steady flow of mules, swallowers, bringing millions of euros to the section leaders in Europe. By the end of the decade, the situation in Spain had reached a critical point. In the years between 2005 and 2010, Spanish authorities conducted a series of mass arrests, analogous to Operation Crown in the United States. Eric Velástegui, King Wolverine, was arrested in 2003 for orchestrating the kidnapping and rape of a young woman attempting to leave the gang. The court sentenced him to 21 years in prison, but, as in King Blood's case, prison walls did not halt the command structure. From his cell in Soto del Real prison, Velástegui continued to dispatch directives demanding stricter discipline and higher quotas. The manifesto written in Chicago in the 1960s was now quoted in Spanish prisons, demonstrating the terrifying universality of this ideology. This period of transformation revealed that the Latin kings had definitively ceased to be solely an American problem. They had evolved into a transnational corporation of violence, capable of adapting to any climate or legislation. The elimination of the leadership in one country merely resulted in the migration of leaders to another. The brand proved stronger than the individuals. The five-pointed gold crown became a symbol instantly recognizable to a Bronx teenager, a migrant in Madrid, or an inmate in Guayaquil. It was no longer a gang, but a borderless subculture of death, and by 2010, it was clear. The old methods of combating it were hopelessly obsolete because the enemy was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Approaching the 2010s, the Latin kings faced an adversary that proved more terrifying than the knives of the Trinitarios, the bullets of the gangster disciples, or even the batons of the police brass. This enemy was federal penitentiary mathematics. In an era where prosecutors began applying the RICO Act with surgical precision, the romantic aura of amor de rey, king's love, dissipated like cocaine dust in the wind. The gangster code of silence, which demanded mute loyalty until the grave, clashed violently with the harsh reality of federal sentencing. Before a simple captured Inca or cacique charged with racketeering, a simple yet brutal dilemma presented itself: face life imprisonment in a concrete box without parole eligibility, or betray every one of his brothers and walk free after 5 or 7 years under the Witness Protection Program. And if in the 1970s and 80s the choice of silence was a matter of honor, in the new millennium, betrayal became the default, turning the organization into a terrarium where everyone carried a recording device under their shirt. Let us pause for a moment and indulge in a bold thought experiment. An alternate history that could have materialized had it not been for this epidemic of informing. Imagine if Antonio Fernandez, King Tone, had succeeded in legitimizing the structure before being betrayed by his closest associates. What if the Latin kings had truly morphed into a political party, leveraging their numbers and discipline to lobby for Latino interests in Washington? They possessed the resources, the manpower, and the ideology. They could have become the new Black Panthers, or an analog to the Young Lords, influencing the election of mayors and senators. But instead of the political podium, they chose the defendant's bench, because greed and fear proved stronger than grand ideas. History is not made with what-ifs, but this unrealized potential makes their downfall even more pathetic. They could have governed cities, yet they ended up merely managing the line for the mess hall. The reality of the 2010s appeared as an endless series of court proceedings where the primary witnesses for the prosecution were yesterday's leaders. The very structure of the gang, its pride, its hierarchy, its paper-based accountability, became its curse. For prosecutors, it was unnecessary to prove that a specific soldier pulled the trigger. It was enough to prove he was part of the enterprise that committed the crimes. The king's hierarchy, with its clear ranks and duties, was a ready-made indictment schematic for the FBI. As soon as a regional officer was broken, the entire branch fell like dominoes. Between 2005 and 2015, almost the entire leadership in Chicago and New York ended up behind bars precisely thanks to the testimony of their own deputies. The response to this internal decomposition was a practice that turned streets and prison blocks into a slaughterhouse for their own members. This was termed giving the green light. It was not just an order, it was a death sentence that never expired. If a green light was placed on a gang member, he instantly became a target for any king eager to climb the ranks. The hunt for snitches took on a paranoid character. Not only were those who truly cooperated with police killed, but also those merely suspected of disloyalty or those who had become inconvenient to the current leader in the struggle for dominance. The gang's internal security transformed into a preemptive repression machine. The most appalling aspect of these purges was their banality. The murder of a traitor was not celebrated as a heroic act. It was dirty work. In 2011, the body of a gang member lured to a picnic by his own brothers was discovered in a Long Island state park. They didn't shoot him. He was beaten to death with bats and hammers to avoid attracting attention with gunfire. The order arrived from prison, scribbled on a piece of tissue paper, kite, hidden in the back of a law book. The executioners, teenagers seeking promotion, didn't even know why they were killing their comrade. They were told he violated the code. That was sufficient. The cynicism of the situation was that the very instigator of the murder, currently in prison, might at that very moment be negotiating with the prosecutor's office to hand over those same executioners in exchange for better confinement conditions. The circle of betrayal was complete. The psychology of the new gangster underwent irreversible changes. An expert from the Chicago Organized Crime Division aptly characterized this era in a 2014 interview. Before, they were ready to die for the crown. Now, they are ready to sell the crown for a cheeseburger and a 6-month sentence reduction. We are no longer hunting ideological fanatics. We are hunting businessmen for whom the cost-benefit analysis is no longer favorable. The code of silence, omerta, became a laughingstock. Infiltrated agents reported that during universal meetings, participants eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who among them was recording the conversation with a dictaphone. The atmosphere of brotherhood was replaced by one of total distrust. By the middle of the decade, the Latin kings represented not a single monolith, but a conglomerate of warring factions, where the left hand knew nothing of what the right was doing and the head was trying to bite its own tail. Old-school leaders like King Blood were rotting in supermax isolation, becoming living mummies whose influence on the street trended toward zero. The new generation of leaders, the so-called Instagram gangsters, lacked that established authority and fear. They compensated by exhibiting uncontrolled aggression, striving to prove their importance through violence that was often senseless and chaotic. Internal wars claimed more gang members' lives than conflicts with external enemies. The organization was devouring itself like a wounded beast, and this process of self-destruction was not triggered by the police, but by that very manifesto which had once united them, but which, in the new realities, had become a tool for manipulation and death. By 2020, only fragmented groups remained upon the ruins of the once great empire, ready at any moment to plunge a knife into the back of the next person, provided the price was right. Today, February 2026, a picture emerges that might initially appear reassuring. Front-page headlines no longer scream about massacres in the Bronx, and names like King Blood or King Tone have become historical artifacts, interesting only to archivist criminologists. However, this is the silence of a graveyard, not of peace. The current status of the Latin kings can be characterized by the medical term zombification. The organization is dead as an ideological monolith, but it persists as a decentralized and indestructible network, having relocated from the icy corners of Chicago to the digital trenches of the darknet and social networks. And whereas in the 1990s you had to survive a brutal initiation ritual in a prison shower to become a king, today, all you need is a smartphone and a TikTok account. Let us observe the birth of the Instagram gangster generation. Young leaders, lacking the prison tempering of their predecessors, utilize encrypted messaging, Signal, Telegram, WhatsApp, to coordinate what was once discussed in basements. Recruitment has become contactless. A teenager in Iowa or the outskirts of Paris sees a video in his feed. Black and gold aesthetics, stacks of cash, weapons, and bats set to the rhythm of aggressive drill rap. This is the 24/7 marketing of death. Social media algorithms have become the new recruiters, operating more effectively than any Inca. But behind this digital facade lies a terrifying economic transformation. The Latin kings have definitively forfeited sovereignty and have become mercenary infantry for the true masters of the criminal world, the Mexican cartels. In the new food chain, the kings occupy the position of retail distributors. They are no longer sovereigns. They are middle managers handling the logistics for the Sinaloa and Jalisco (CJNG) cartels. The commodity they distribute now is more lethal than the heroin of the 1980s. It is fentanyl, a synthetic death that requires no coca fields or jungle labs. Let us perform a cynical but necessary economic calculation to understand the scope of this plague. The production cost of a single pill containing a lethal dose of fentanyl is about 10 or 15 cents for Mexican labs. On the streets of Chicago or Boston, the kings sell it for $10 or $20. The margin is in the thousands of percentage points. They do not need to build an empire, they merely need to be an efficient delivery service, collecting a blood tithe from the overdose epidemic that claims over 100,000 American lives annually. The illusion that law enforcement has defeated this hydra shatters against the raw facts of police reports from recent years. Operation Throne, conducted by the FBI in December 2019, was a cold shower for those who had written the gang off. During a massive sweep across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, 62 high-level East Coast leaders were arrested. The feds uncovered a structure operating with terrifying efficiency. A system of internal courts, minutes from meetings, and video reports of traitor beatings. Agents seized not only dozens of weapons and kilos of narcotics, but also evidence that the gang was attempting to infiltrate legitimate structures, from school boards to labor unions. But even this blow was not fatal. In 2023, a series of arrests in Florida and Texas revealed that for every incarcerated leader, 2 new ones emerge, younger and more vicious. They do not know the manifesto by heart. They are ignorant of Lord Gino's history, but they are ready to kill for the likes and reposts that confirm their status. The brand's globalization means that today, the Latin Kings function as a franchise with branches in 34 U.S. states and also in Spain, Italy, Ecuador, and Peru. According to the most conservative estimates from Europol and the FBI, the total number of active members globally ranges between 35,000 and 50,000 individuals. This is the population of a small city, entirely composed of armed individuals bound by a code of silence and readiness for violence. The situation in Europe is particularly alarming. In Madrid and Milan, the Kings have morphed into hybrid youth groups controlling entire neighborhoods, dedicating themselves to robbery and human trafficking. Spanish police regularly dismantle coronations, initiation ceremonies, attended by children as young as 12 or 13. This is no longer the importation of an American problem. It is an autonomous European scourge. In Ecuador, the historical homeland of many founders, the Latin Kings have integrated so deeply into the prison self-governance system that governments are forced to negotiate with them as a political entity to avert riots and massacres. To summarize this bloody saga, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The Latin Kings are not simply a criminal group. They are a social phenomenon, a mirror reflecting society's ills, racism, poverty, prison system corruption, and the craving for belonging. They survived the 1950s when they were beaten with clubs. They survived the 1990s when their leaders were sealed in concrete Supermax boxes. They survived the 2000s when they were ripped apart by internal wars. And they persist now, in the age of digital transparency, having learned to hide in plain sight. Their significance is measured not only by billions in drug money and thousands of corpses, but also by the shattered destinies of generations for whom the gold crown became the only alternative to despair. And now, the most critical point. Do you think this story remained confined to the ghettos of Chicago or the screens of crime news broadcasts? You are mistaken. Look at the teenager living in your own building. Look at their phone. Perhaps right now, as you read these words, they are receiving an invitation to a closed chat featuring a profile picture shaped like a 5-pointed crown. The Kings have not died. They have merely retreated into the digital shadow, becoming invisible and thus doubly dangerous. The war for minds and streets is not over. It has simply changed format. If this account has compelled you to look differently at the real world outside comfortable illusions, if you wish to know the truth about those pulling the strings of global crime, the monsters who live among us, subscribe to the channel right now. This was just one dossier. Ahead of us lie stories of cartels richer than some states, gangs controlling European ports, and individuals who have turned murder into a high-yield business. Hit that subscribe button and the bell. In the world of shadows, knowledge is the only weapon you possess. Do not miss the next investigation. Welcome to the dark side of reality.